My parents refused to pay $3,500 to save my leg because they had just bought a boat. My mother told me that a permanent limp would teach me humility, and that no man wants a wife who runs around a professional kitchen anyway. My sister laughed and said I would manage. They did not know that by saving their money that day, they cost themselves everything they owned. 3 years later, I didn't just walk again. I walked into their bank with a lawyer and the deed to their house. But to understand the sweetness of that victory, you have to feel the pain of the moment they left me to be butchered. Before I tell you how I took their legacy, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had family who treated you like an option instead of a priority. My name is Tyra Jones, and at 32 years old, I thought I knew what pain was. I had burned my arms on industrial ovens and sliced my fingers during dinner rushes as an executive chef. But waking up at Grady Memorial Hospital felt different. It felt like someone had replaced the blood in my veins with liquid fire. The smell of antiseptic was suffocating. I tried to sit up, but a scream caught in my throat. My right leg was unrecognizable. It was swollen purple and twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn. I remembered the motorcycle skidding, the sound of metal crunching, and then darkness. Now I was staring at the ruin of my career. A nurse with tired eyes held my shoulders down. Then Dr. Evans walked in holding an X-ray. He did not sugarcoat it. He told me my tibia and fibula were shattered and the Achilles tendon was severed. Bone fragments were pressing on the artery. He gave me two choices: immediate surgery with titanium rods to save the leg and my career, or if I could not pay, they would stabilize it, cast it, and I would walk with a cane and a severe limp for the rest of my life. I told him to operate immediately. Being a chef is not just a job for me. It is who I am. I stand for 14 hours a day. I need my legs. That is when the room went silent. He looked at the chart and told me my insurance was declined. It had been terminated 3 weeks ago. I needed $3,500 cash up front for the hardware and anesthesia. I felt cold all over. I told him there must be a mistake. I was on the family premium plan with my parents. I sent my mother $500 every month to cover my share. The nurse looked at me with pity and said the system showed I had been removed from the policy. I checked my bank account on my cracked phone screen, $42. I had just drained my savings to put a deposit on a lease for my own restaurant, a dream I had been working toward for 10 years. I had nothing. My only hope was the people who were supposed to love me. I dialed my father, Otis. The phone rang and rang. Finally, he picked up. I could hear the sound of wind and smooth jazz music in the background. I could hear clinking glasses and laughter. I told him I was at the hospital. I told him my leg was shattered, and they were going to leave me disabled if I did not get the money. I begged him. I swallowed every ounce of pride I had and begged him to help me. Then I heard my mother Vernell chime in. She was on speakerphone. Her voice was not worried, it was annoyed. She asked why I was calling with so much drama. I asked her about the insurance. I asked her why I was uncovered when I had sent her the money. She let out a sigh that sounded like she was dealing with an unruly child. She said she had to make a choice. My younger sister Bianca had just been scouted for a modeling gig. Bianca needed veneers, $12,000 for a perfect smile. My mother said Bianca needed her smile to make money, whereas I spent my life hiding in a kitchen, smelling like grease, so I did not need premium coverage. She said she cut my insurance to pay the monthly installment for my sister's teeth. I lay there in the hospital bed, tears hot and angry streaming down my face. I screamed that I was going to lose my career. I told them this was my life. My father shouted over me. He sounded angry that I was interrupting his afternoon. He said I was selfish. He told me they were at the marina. They were putting the down payment on a yacht they were naming the Legacy. He said all their liquid cash was tied up in the deposit. If they pulled out now to pay for my surgery, they would lose $50,000. I asked him if a boat was worth more than his daughter's ability to walk. He laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound. He told me that maybe a limp would be good for me. He said I was 32 and unmarried. He said if I could not run around so much, maybe I would stay home, learn to embroider, and finally find a husband who likes a quiet woman. He told me to stop whining, get the cast, and save money on shoes. Then Bianca came on the line. Her voice was sweet and poisonous. She told me to be a big girl and stop ruining Mom and Dad's big day. She said the boat was beautiful and I should be happy for them. Then she hung up. The line went dead. I dropped the phone. It hit the linoleum floor. The silence in the room was louder than my screaming had been. The doctor looked at his watch. He said the golden hour was over. The tissue was swelling too much. He could not wait any longer. Without the payment, he had to proceed with the non-surgical option. He was going to set the bone manually and cast it. He told me I would likely have chronic pain and limited mobility forever. I closed my eyes. I felt the darkness coming back. But this time it wasn't from the accident. It was the darkness of absolute betrayal. My parents had chosen a boat. They had chosen my sister's fake teeth. They had chosen to let me break. As the doctor called for the orderlies to hold me down for the procedure, I didn't feel the pain in my leg anymore. All I felt was a cold, hard knot forming in my chest. They thought I was just a broke, crippled chef. They thought I was helpless. They had no idea that while they were toasting champagne on their new boat, they had just created their worst enemy. I took a breath and prepared for the pain, knowing that when I healed, I would come for everything they loved. The silence that followed the dial tone was heavier than the cast the doctor was preparing to plaster onto my shattered leg. I watched the nurses set up a tray of metal instruments that looked more like torture devices than medical tools. They were preparing to manually reset my bones without the surgery. I needed a procedure that would almost certainly leave me with a permanent limp and chronic pain. My career as an executive chef was effectively over before the anesthesia even touched my veins. I closed my eyes, trying to dissociate from the reality that my parents were currently sipping champagne on a yacht while I was about to lose everything. Suddenly, the double doors of the emergency room flew open with such force that they banged against the walls. A hurricane of grease denim and panic rushed into the sterile room. It was Jalen. My younger brother looked like he had run straight from under the hood of a car. His blue mechanic's jumpsuit was stained black with oil, and there was a smudge of grease across his forehead. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving as his frantic eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. When he saw the mangled state of my leg, the color drained from his face, making the oil smudges stand out even more. He rushed to my bedside, his hands hovering over me, afraid to touch me and cause more pain. For the first time in my life, I saw my little brother look terrified. Jalen had always been the quiet one, the one who took things in stride, but seeing his big sister broken shattered his composure. He asked me what was happening and why they were not prepping me for surgery. I could barely whisper the truth. I told him about the insurance. I told him about the $3,500. I told him about Mom and Dad and the boat. Jalen went rigid. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth would crack. He pulled out his phone, his greasy fingers leaving marks on the screen, and dialed our mother. I tried to stop him. I told him it was useless, but he was already shouting into the receiver. He put it on speaker so I could hear. He pleaded with her. He told her I was lying in a hospital bed about to be crippled. He asked how they could buy a boat when I needed surgery. Mom's voice came through sharp and dismissive. She told Jalen to stop being dramatic. She said I was manipulating him just like I always tried to manipulate them. She told him not to be a fool, and that if he gave me any money, he was enabling my irresponsibility. Then she said the most hurtful thing of all. She said that he should focus on keeping his own head above water with his dirty little mechanic job instead of worrying about my problems. Then she hung up on him just like she had hung up on me. Jalen stared at the phone for a long moment. He didn't scream. He didn't throw it. He just looked at me with an expression of profound sorrow. Then, without saying a word, he turned around and ran out of the hospital room. I called after him, but my voice was too weak. He was gone. The door swung shut and the silence returned. Tears of absolute defeat slid down my cheeks. I thought he had left because he couldn't bear to watch. I thought he had realized, just like my parents, that I wasn't worth the trouble. I lay there for 45 minutes listening to the clock tick, waiting for the doctor to return and finish off my dreams. I had accepted my fate. I was going to be the limping, unemployed spinster my mother always said I would be. The doctor returned with 2 orderlies. He apologized and said they could not wait any longer. They began to position my leg. The pain was blinding. I gritted my teeth and prepared to scream, "Stop!" The voice was breathless but commanding. Jalen stood in the doorway again. He was sweating profusely now, his jumpsuit soaked. He walked straight up to the doctor and slammed a thick, messy stack of bills onto the metal tray right next to the bone saw. He told them to count it. He said there was $3,800 there. He demanded they prep the operating room immediately. The doctor looked surprised but signaled the nurse to count the cash. It was a mix of hundreds, 20s, and even wrinkled singles. It smelled like engine oil and old paper. As the nurse counted, Jalen moved to my side and took my hand. His hand was trembling. I looked at him confused. Jalen lived paycheck to paycheck. He was a freelance mechanic working out of the back of his truck. He didn't have savings. Where did he get almost $4,000 in less than an hour? Then I saw it. Sticking out of his chest pocket was a yellow carbon copy slip. I reached out and pulled it free. It was a receipt from Quick Cash Pawn Shop, a predatory place down on 4th Street, that paid pennies on the dollar for quick sales. I read the item description and my heart stopped. Snap-on Master Series tool chest and complete set. I looked at Jalen, horror washing over me. Those were not just tools. In the world of high-end mechanics, Snap-on tools are like gold. They are precision instruments that cost a fortune. Jalen had spent 7 years collecting them. Every time he made a little extra money, he bought a new wrench, a new diagnostic computer, a new socket set. That tool chest was his life. It was his career. It was the only reason he could charge premium rates for his work. Without them, he was just a guy with bare hands. He had sold his livelihood, likely for 1/3 of what it was worth, just to get cash fast. I started to cry, shaking my head. I told him he couldn't do this. I told him those tools were his future. I told him to go back and get them. Jalen squeezed my hand, silencing me. He wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb, leaving a faint streak of oil that felt like a badge of honor. He looked me dead in the eyes and said something I will never forget as long as I live. He told me that tools can be replaced, but I cannot be replaced. He said he can lift boxes or wash cars with his back, but I need my legs to stand in my kitchen. He said I was the only one who ever believed in him when he wanted to fix cars instead of going to college. He said I was his queen, and a queen does not bow down, and she certainly does not limp. The nurse finished counting. She nodded to the doctor. The payment was cleared. As the anesthesia mask was placed over my face, the last thing I saw was Jalen sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair in the corner. He looked small, exhausted, and empty-handed. He had stripped himself of everything he owned to save me. As the darkness of sleep took me, the fire of vengeance that had sparked during my parents' phone call roared into an inferno. My parents had refused to pay a dime. My brother had paid with his future. When I woke up hours later, the surgery was a success. My leg was full of titanium pins and rods, but the doctor said I would make a full recovery. I would walk, I would cook, I would stand tall. Jalen was asleep in the chair, his head resting against the wall, his hands open and empty on his lap. I lay there watching the rise and fall of his chest, making a silent vow to the universe. My parents wanted a legacy. They wanted a boat named the Legacy to show off to their rich friends. Well, they were going to get a legacy, but not the one they expected. I was going to take that boat. I was going to take their house. I was going to take every single thing they valued more than their children. And with it, I was going to build a golden throne for the mechanic sleeping in the corner. They had broken my leg, but they had strengthened my resolve. The surgery fixed my bone, but Jalen's sacrifice fixed my heart. And now it was time to get to work. 6 months is a long time to watch a dream die. In the culinary world, 6 months is an eternity. Trends change, restaurants open and close, and executive chefs are replaced before the stove even has time to cool down. For me, the last half year has been a slow, agonizing descent into a reality I never asked for. I woke up that Saturday morning to the familiar throbbing in my right leg. The titanium rods and screws that now held my bones together felt heavy, like I was dragging a boat anchor around my ankle. The doctor called it a successful recovery. I called it a prison sentence. I sat up on the futon that served as my bed, wincing as I swung my legs onto the cold floor of the studio apartment. This was our new life. After I lost the lease on my dream restaurant space and drained my bank account, I could not afford my old place. Jalen, being the angel that he is, insisted we move in together to save money. We found this 400-square-foot shoebox in a rundown complex on the outskirts of Atlanta. It smelled of stale cigarettes and damp drywall, but it was cheap. I looked over at Jalen. He was sleeping on a pile of blankets in the corner because he insisted I take the futon. My heart broke all over again looking at him. His hands, once smooth and calloused only in the specific places where a mechanic grips his precision tools, were now raw and covered in cuts. Since selling his Snap-on tool set to pay for my surgery, he had been taking whatever work he could find. He was washing cars by hand, doing heavy lifting at a warehouse, and fixing engines with cheap borrowed wrenches that stripped bolts and bruised his knuckles. He looked 10 years older than 29. I grabbed my cane from the floor. It was a sturdy, ugly thing made of gray aluminum. I hated it. Every time I heard the click of the rubber tip against the floor, it reminded me of what I had lost. I had tried to go back to work at the restaurant 3 months after the surgery. I thought I could push through the pain. I lasted 4 hours. You cannot run a high-volume kitchen when you cannot pivot and sprint. I was too slow. I was a liability. The owner, a man I had worked for 5 years, let me go with a pitying look and a 2-week severance check. Now I was applying for line cook jobs at diners that wouldn't even call me back once they saw the cane. A sharp knock at the door shattered the morning silence. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the rhythmic, demanding pounding of people who believe they own the world. I knew that knock. Jalen stirred, rubbing his eyes. I told him to stay down and that I would get it. I limped to the door and opened it. The hallway was dim, but the group standing there seemed to radiate an artificial brightness. It was my parents, Otis and Vernell, along with my sister Bianca and her husband Connor. They swept into the tiny apartment like a gust of expensive perfume and entitlement. My mother wrinkled her nose immediately, her eyes scanning the peeling paint on the ceiling and the stack of medical bills on the counter. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask if my leg hurt. "Well, isn't this cozy?" my father said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He was wearing a polo shirt with a sailing logo on the chest. He looked tan and rested. We were in the neighborhood picking up some supplies for the boat, Bianca chirped, pulling a sleek iPhone out of her designer bag. She flashed a smile that was blindingly white. Those were the veneers my mother had prioritized over my leg. $12,000 of porcelain shining in the dim light of my poverty. You have to see the photos of the launch party, Tyra. It was incredible. She shoved the phone in my face. I looked at the screen. There was the boat. The Legacy. It was a 30-foot cruiser with white leather seats and polished chrome rails. In the photo, my parents were holding champagne flutes, laughing with a group of people I didn't recognize. They looked like the picture-perfect successful family. There was no sign of the daughter they abandoned or the son they ignored. "It is a beauty, isn't it?" Connor said, stepping forward. He was a tall, broad-shouldered white man who worked in commercial real estate. He had always looked at me with a mix of amusement and disdain, but today his gaze was sharper. He looked down at my leg, at the swollen ankle visible beneath the hem of my sweatpants, and then at the cane leaning against the wall. He let out a short, cruel chuckle. You know, Tyra, I was saying to Bianca just the other day that everything happens for a reason. Look at you. You are struggling to even walk to the fridge. Imagine if you had a husband and kids to take care of right now. You would be useless. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. Excuse me, I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. Connor shrugged, picking up an apple from our fruit bowl and tossing it in the air. I am just being a realist. Men want a woman who is active, someone who looks good on their arm at events, not someone they have to help up the stairs. It is actually lucky that you are single, because let us be honest, who is going to want to take on a burden like this? A wife with a limp is not exactly a trophy. You should probably get used to this little apartment. It suits your new reality. I felt tears stinging my eyes, not from sadness, but from humiliation. He was reducing my entire existence, my talent, my drive, my soul down to my injured leg. He was telling me that because I was damaged, I was unlovable. Before I could respond, my mother chimed in. She was running a finger along the top of our second-hand television, checking for dust. She looked at her fingertip and grimaced. Connor is just trying to give you some tough love, Tyra, she said, wiping her hand on a tissue she pulled from her purse. And honestly, look at this place. It is filthy. There is dust everywhere. The dishes are piling up. No wonder you got fired from that fancy restaurant. If you cannot even keep a 400-square-foot box clean, how are you supposed to run a kitchen? I got fired because I physically could not stand, I whispered. Excuses, my father boomed. He was looking at Jalen, who was standing in the corner with his fists clenched by his sides. Jalen looked ready to fight, but I caught his eye and shook my head. We could not afford a fight. We could not afford bail money if Jalen punched Connor. You have always been soft, Tyra, my father continued. You let one little accident define you. Look at us. We worked hard, we made smart choices, and now we have the legacy. You and Jalen, you make bad choices. You sell good tools for pennies. You waste money on rent for a dump like this. Poverty is a mindset, and you two are drowning in it. Bianca laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, Daddy, do not be so mean. Maybe Tyra can come work on the boat. We need someone to polish the brass railings. Since she is already down on the floor half the time anyway, it might be a perfect fit. They all laughed. My parents, my sister, my brother-in-law. They stood in my tiny, sad home and laughed at my pain. They laughed at the scar that ran down my leg. They laughed at the poverty they had forced us into. Get out, I said. It wasn't a scream. It was a low, guttural growl. My mother stopped laughing and looked at me with cold eyes. Excuse me. I pointed to the door with my cane. Get out. Take your veneers and your boat photos and get out of my house. My father sneered. Ungrateful. That is what you are. We come here to share our joy with you, and you act like a bitter cripple. Come on, Vernell, let us go. The air in here is depressing. They filed out, leaving the door wide open behind them. I watched them walk down the hallway, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls. Connor shouted back one last thing. Do not forget to apply for disability checks, Tyra. Don't not be too proud to take the handout. You are going to need it. When they were gone, Jalen slammed the door shut and locked it. He turned to me, tears of anger streaming down his face. I am going to kill them, he said. I swear, Tyra, I am going to make them pay. I looked down at my leg. It was throbbing harder now, fueled by the adrenaline and the shame, but for the first time in 6 months, I didn't feel like a victim. Connor was right about one thing. This was my new reality. But he was wrong about my future. He thought I was a burden. He thought I was finished. I limped over to the window and watched them get into their luxury SUV in the parking lot. I watched my father hold the door for my mother. I watched Bianca check her teeth in the side mirror. They think I am broken, I said to Jalen, my voice steady and cold as steel. They think I am just a cripple living in a box. Let them think that. Let them think I am helpless. Because while they are busy polishing that boat, I am going to be sharpening my knives. I turned to Jalen. Do you still have that contact for the wholesale food distributor? The one who used to fix his truck with you? Jalen nodded, confused. Yeah. Why? Because I am done crying. Jalen, I am done looking for a job. We are going to make our own. And when we are done, that boat is going to look like a toy compared to what we build. Connor thinks no man wants a wife who limps. Fine. I do not need a husband. I need an empire. That afternoon, in the midst of our humiliation, listening to the insults replay in my head, the chef in me died. And something else was born. Something colder. Something harder. Something that would not stop until the legacy belonged to us. The phone call from my mother came 3 days before the grand unveiling of the legacy. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Part of me, the foolish inner child part that still craved validation, hoped she was calling to apologize. I hoped she was calling to say they had made a mistake, that they missed me, that I was still their daughter. But when I answered, Vernell Jones did not offer an apology. She offered a demand. She told me that catering for the yacht warming party was proving to be astronomically expensive. She complained that the local chefs were charging robbery rates for seafood platters and canapes. Then came the pivot. She said that since I was currently unemployed and sitting around doing nothing, I should come and handle the food. It was not a request. It was framed as an opportunity for me to redeem myself, a chance to be useful to the family that, in her twisted view, I had disappointed by becoming disabled. I tried to refuse. I told her my leg could not handle standing for 6 hours on a moving vessel. I told her the doctor advised rest. My mother scoffed. She told me to stop being a martyr. She said if I could walk to the fridge, I could walk around a galley kitchen. She said if I did not come, I should not bother showing up for Thanksgiving or Christmas ever again. It was emotional blackmail, pure and simple. And because I was broken and desperate to keep some connection to my bloodline, I agreed. When I arrived at the marina that Saturday, the sun was glinting off the polished chrome of 100 expensive boats. The Legacy sat at the end of the dock, a 30-foot monument to my parents' vanity. It was gleaming white with plush leather seats and a sound system pumping out smooth jazz. I walked down the dock, my cane clicking rhythmically against the wood, a heavy garment bag over my shoulder containing the ingredients I had bought with my own meager food stamps. My mother met me at the gangway. She looked immaculate in a cream-colored linen suit and oversized sunglasses. She did not hug me. She did not offer to help with the heavy bag. Instead, she held out a plastic hanger. On it hung a black uniform, a maid uniform. I froze. I asked her what this was. I told her I was a chef, not a servant. She lowered her sunglasses and looked me up and down with that familiar look of disdain. She said that guests are people who contribute to the family's success. She said that since I was there as the help I needed to look like the help. She told me she did not want guests getting confused and thinking I was one of them, especially with my leg and my cane ruining the aesthetic of her party. I wanted to throw the uniform into the harbor. I wanted to turn around and limp away. But the shame was a heavy weight pinning me in place. I went down to the tiny, cramped galley kitchen below deck and changed. The uniform was tight and made of cheap, scratchy polyester. I looked in the small mirror. The executive chef who had commanded kitchens serving hundreds of covers a night was gone. Staring back at me was a broken woman in a maid's dress. For the next 4 hours I worked through the pain. The galley was hot and airless. The boat rocked gently with the tide, a motion that sent sharp, shooting pains through my titanium-reinforced ankle every time I shifted my weight. I prepared lobster tails, seared scallops, and intricate fruit displays. I plated them with the precision of a master, trying to lose myself in the art of cooking, trying to forget that upstairs my family was drinking champagne paid for with the money that should have saved my leg. When the food was ready, my mother buzzed the intercom. She told me to bring the trays up. I loaded a heavy silver platter with crystal glasses of red wine and appetizers. I left my cane downstairs because she had forbidden me from using it on the deck, claiming the rubber tip would scuff the teak wood floor. I climbed the stairs, gripping the railing, biting my lip until it bled to keep from crying out. I emerged onto the sun-drenched deck. The party was in full swing. My father was holding court near the captain's chair, laughing loudly. Connor and Bianca were lounging on the white leather seats looking like a magazine ad for the perfect life. I moved through the crowd offering food. Most of the guests ignored me, treating me like part of the furniture. Then I reached my family. Connor looked at me, took a scallop and chewed it dramatically. He told Bianca that at least I was finally good for something. He said the uniform suited me. He said it was good, I knew my place. Bianca giggled. She looked beautiful and malicious sipping her drink. She whispered that I looked like a penguin, waddling around without my cane. I tried to ignore them. I turned to walk away to serve the guests on the other side of the boat. As I passed Bianca, I felt something hard hook around my good ankle. It was her foot. She had deliberately stuck her leg out to trip me. With no cane to support me and my bad leg too weak to catch my weight, I had no chance. I pitched forward. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the silver platter tilt. I saw the crystal glasses slide. I crashed onto the hard teak deck with a sickening thud. The platter clattered loudly, and the red wine 5 glasses of expensive vintage Merlot went flying. It splashed across the white leather seats. It soaked the hem of a guest's white silk trousers. And a large dark crimson puddle began to spread across the pristine brand-new wooden floor of the Legacy. The music stopped. The laughter died. The silence was absolute. I lay there, stunned, pain radiating from my knees and elbows. I looked up to see my mother rushing toward me. For a split second, I thought she was coming to see if I was hurt. I thought she would help me up. Instead, a sharp, stinging pain exploded across my cheek. She had slapped me, right there in front of 50 people. The sound of the slap echoed across the water. My face burned. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring my vision. My mother stood over me, her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She screamed at me. She called me a clumsy, useless girl. She screamed that I had ruined the leather. She screamed that red wine would stain the teak forever. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not look at my leg, which was throbbing so hard I thought the screws might burst out of the skin. Bianca sat there, a hand over her mouth in mock shock, her eyes dancing with amusement. "Oh my God," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I think she had too much to drink. That is so embarrassing." My father walked over, looked at the mess and shook his head. He told me to clean it up. He said I was not to leave that spot until every drop of wine was gone. And so in front of the wealthy elite of Atlanta, in front of the sister who tripped me and the parents who despised me, I crawled. I dragged my broken body across the deck. I used the hem of my maid's apron to scrub at the wine stains. I scrubbed until my knuckles were raw. I scrubbed while hot tears dripped onto the wood mixing with the wine. I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel their judgment. But as I scrubbed, the shame began to curdle into something else, something cold and hard and sharp. I listened to my mother apologizing to the guests, blaming my clumsiness, distancing herself from me. I looked at the red stain on the wood. It looked like blood. It looked like a wound. I realized then that this was not just a stain. This was the end. I was done seeking their love. I was done trying to prove my worth. As I wiped the last of the wine from the floor, I made a silent promise to the girl reflecting in the puddle. I would never kneel before them again. The next time I set foot on a boat, it would be mine. And the next time they saw me, I would not be wearing a uniform. I would be wearing the suit of the person who owned their debt. I finished cleaning. I pulled myself up, using the railing, ignoring the gasps of the guests as I stood on my trembling legs. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at Bianca. I limped to the stairs, went down to the galley, retrieved my cane and my street clothes, and walked off the Legacy without saying a word. My mother shouted after me, asking where I was going, telling me there were dishes to wash. I kept walking. The sound of my cane hitting the dock was the only answer she got. Click, click, click. The sound of a countdown beginning. The walk from the sun-drenched deck down to the lower cabins felt like a descent into the underworld. The laughter of the guests above faded into a muffled rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. My cheek was still throbbing where my mother had slapped me. The heat of her hand seemed to have branded my skin, marking me not as a daughter, but as a servant who had stepped out of line. But the pain in my face was nothing compared to the agony in my leg. The adrenaline of the fall was wearing off, replaced by a deep grinding ache where the titanium screws were torqued into my bone. Every step down the narrow carpeted stairs sent a shockwave through my body, but I refused to stop. I needed to get out of that maid uniform. I needed to get my street clothes, get my cane, and get as far away from the legacy as possible. I made my way to the master stateroom at the end of the hall. This was where my mother had told me to store my bag, tossing it into the corner like it was trash. I pushed the door open. The room was expansive, far larger than the entire apartment I shared with Jalen. It smelled of expensive leather, sea salt, and my mother's cloying perfume. It was a shrine to their ego. A king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, mahogany paneling, and a large desk made of polished glass. I limped over to the corner to grab my bag, but my leg gave way. I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the glass desk to keep from hitting the floor. My hand swept across the surface, knocking over a heavy crystal tumbler and sending a stack of papers sliding across the smooth glass. I sighed, steadying myself. Even in my exit, I was making a mess. I reached out to gather the papers, terrified that my mother would come down and accuse me of snooping. I just wanted to stack them and leave. But as my hand hovered over the top document, the bold black letters at the top of the page caught my eye. Loan agreement. Secured promissory note. It was standard banking paperwork. I had seen plenty of it when I was applying for my restaurant lease. I started to push it aside, not caring about their finances, but then a name in the center of the page made my blood run cold. Borrower Tyra L. Jones. I blinked, thinking the pain and the wine fumes were making me hallucinate. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. There it was, typed in crisp, undeniable ink. Tyra L. Jones. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of confusion and dread. Why was my name on a loan agreement? I picked up the document, my hands trembling so hard the paper rattled. I scanned the lines. Principal amount $500,000. Collateral. The vessel known as the Legacy. Guarantor none. I flipped to the last page, and there at the bottom was a signature. My signature. Or at least it looked like mine. The loop of the T was slightly too wide. The slant of the J was a fraction too sharp. But to a bank teller who didn't know me, it was a perfect match. I stared at the date next to the signature. It was dated 3 weeks ago. The timeline crashed into me like a physical blow. 3 weeks ago. That was 2 days after my accident. That was while I was lying in a hospital bed, high on painkillers, crying because I couldn't afford surgery. The room began to spin. I grabbed the edge of the desk, forcing myself to breathe. It all made sense. The pieces of the puzzle that had been tormenting me suddenly clicked into a horrifying picture. My parents had terrible credit. They had spent years living beyond their means, leveraging one debt to pay another, maintaining the illusion of wealth while drowning in red ink. No bank would lend them $500,000 for a luxury yacht. Their credit score was likely in the 500s, but mine. Before the accident, before the medical bills destroyed me, my credit score was 780. I had built it meticulously for a decade, paying every bill on time, keeping my utilization low, preparing for the day I would need a business loan for my restaurant. They knew that. They knew my financial health was perfect. So while I was unconscious or groggy from trauma, they had taken my information. They had forged my signature. They had used my identity to secure the loan for this boat. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The legacy. This boat wasn't theirs. It was mine. Legally on paper, I was the owner of this floating palace. I was the one responsible for the $500,000 debt. And the reason they couldn't give me $3,500 for my surgery? It wasn't because their money was tied up. It was because they needed every cent of cash they had for the down payment to close this fraudulent deal before I woke up and noticed the credit inquiry. They had traded my leg for a boat. They had looked at their daughter broken and begging for help, and decided that securing a luxury toy in her name was more important than her ability to walk. They had enslaved me to a lifetime of debt without my consent. If they defaulted on this loan and knowing their spending habits, they absolutely would. The bank wouldn't come after them. They would come after me. They would garnish the wages I couldn't earn. They would seize assets I didn't have. They had set me up to be the fall guy for their vanity. I felt a scream building in my chest, a primal animalistic sound of pure betrayal, but I swallowed it down. Screaming wouldn't help. Screaming would just bring them down here and they would snatch the papers away, gaslight me, tell me I was crazy. No. This required silence. This required the cold, hard precision of a chef deboning a fish. I looked at the signature again. It was my mother's handiwork. I recognized the flourish. She used to practice my signature when I was a child, signing my report cards when she was too busy to look at them. She had been grooming me for this kind of theft my whole life. My eyes drifted to the side of the desk. There was a notary stamp on the other papers. A notary named Patricia Evans. I knew that name. She was one of my mother's bridge club friends. A woman who would stamp anything for a bottle of wine and a gossip session. They had conspired. It was a criminal ring, and the victim was their own flesh and blood. The tears that had been falling since the slap on the deck stopped instantly. My eyes felt dry and hot. The sadness that had weighed me down for 6 months evaporated, replaced by a clarity so sharp it cut. I was not a daughter anymore. I was a victim of identity theft. I was a victim of fraud. And the people upstairs drinking champagne and laughing at my limp were not my parents. They were criminals. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady now. I took photos of every single page of the loan agreement. I took photos of the notary stamp. I took photos of the registration papers listing me as the owner. Then I carefully folded the original documents and slid them into the hidden pocket of my garment bag. I stripped off the maid uniform. I didn't bother folding it. I let it drop to the floor in a heap. I pulled on my jeans and my oversized sweater. I grabbed my cane. I looked around the room one last time. It looked different now. It didn't look like a symbol of their success. It looked like evidence. I walked to the door, my cane clicking softly on the carpet. I didn't feel the pain in my leg anymore. All I felt was the weight of the papers in my bag. They were heavy, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of leverage. It was the weight of a nuclear bomb that I was going to carry out of here and detonate at the perfect moment. I climbed the stairs back to the deck. The party was winding down. My mother saw me emerging from the hatch. She frowned, starting to walk toward me, probably to scold me for taking too long or to demand I wash more dishes. Leaving so soon, she called out, her voice shrill. "We haven't cut the cake yet." I didn't stop. I didn't look at her. I walked straight past her, my eyes fixed on the dock. "I said I am talking to you, Tyra," she snapped, grabbing my arm. I stopped. I turned my head slowly and looked at her hand on my arm. Then I looked up into her eyes. For the first time in my life, she flinched. She saw something in my expression that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the pleading look of a child seeking approval. It was the dead, hollow look of a stranger. I removed her hand from my arm. Gently, firmly. "Enjoy the boat, Mother," I said. My voice was quiet, barely a whisper, but it cut through the jazz music like a knife. "Take good care of it." She looked confused, opening her mouth to speak, but I was already moving. I walked down the gangway, the wood vibrating under my feet. I walked past Jalen, who was waiting for me in the parking lot with his beat-up truck. He saw my face and started the engine without a word. He knew. He didn't know what I had found, but he knew the war had started. As we drove away, I looked back at the Legacy one last time in the side mirror. It was gleaming white and beautiful against the setting sun. My parents were standing on the deck, waving to their friends, oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a trap door. They thought they had gotten away with it. They thought I was too stupid, too broken, too weak to ever find out. I reached into my bag and touched the cool paper of the loan agreement. "Drive Jalen," I said. "We have a meeting with a lawyer." Jalen looked at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "What did you find?" he asked. I pulled the papers out and laid them on the dashboard. "I found out that I am not broke," I said, staring at the $500,000 figure. "I found out that I just bought a boat. And I think it is time for an eviction." The engine of Jalen's rusted pickup truck rumbled beneath us, vibrating through the soles of my shoes and sending dull aches up my metal-reinforced leg. We were parked 2 blocks away from the marina, watching the mast of the Legacy bobbing in the distance. Jalen had his hand on the door handle, his knuckles white. He wanted to march into the police station right then and there. He wanted to throw the photos of the forged loan documents onto a detective's desk and watch the handcuffs click around our parents' wrists. I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. My grip was firm. I told him no, not yet. He looked at me like I was crazy. He asked why I would protect them after what they did. I told him I wasn't protecting them. I was preparing them. If we went to the police now, my father would hire a slick lawyer. He would cry to the judge about a misunderstanding. He would claim I gave verbal consent. My mother would play the victim, saying she was just trying to secure assets for the family trust. They might get a slap on the wrist, a fine, they would pay with more borrowed money, and then they would go right back to their yacht. They would spin the story to make me look like the ungrateful daughter who tried to send her elderly parents to jail. I told Jalen that I did not want a slap on the wrist. I wanted total annihilation. I wanted them to feel the floor drop out from under them when they were standing at their highest point. I wanted them to invest every ounce of their ego, their reputation, and their false pride into that boat and that stolen land. And then when they had nothing left to leverage, I wanted to take it all. We drove back to our cramped studio apartment in silence. The air in the room was stale, smelling of old carpet and the faint chemical scent of the cleaning supplies I used to obsessively scrub the floors. I looked at the tiny kitchenette. It was laughable. A 2-burner electric stove, a mini fridge that hummed too loudly, and barely 2 feet of counter space. It was a far cry from the stainless steel industrial kitchen I used to command. But as I looked at it, I didn't see poverty. I saw a bunker. This was where the war would be won. I turned to Jalen and told him the plan. We had no capital for a restaurant. We had no credit because my identity was currently hijacked by a $500,000 boat loan. We couldn't hire staff. But we had my hands. We had his drive, and we had the internet. We were going to open a ghost kitchen, a restaurant that existed only on delivery apps. No storefront, no tables, no waiters to sneer at my limp. Just food. Pure, undeniable flavor delivered in brown paper bags. But there was a problem. My confidence was shattered. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the woman my mother called clumsy and ugly. I saw the chef who fell on the deck. I didn't want my face associated with this. I didn't want people to buy the food out of pity for the crippled girl. I wanted them to buy it because it was an addiction. I went to the drawer and pulled out a black cotton face mask, the kind we all wore during the pandemic. I put it on. I pulled my hair back into a tight knot. I looked at Jalen and told him that Tyra Jones was dead for now. From this moment on, I was the masked chef. We spent the last of our cash literally digging coins out of the truck's ashtray to buy chicken wings, spices, and honey. That night, the apartment transformed. Jalen set up an assembly line on the living room floor. He was the logistics manager, the dishwasher, and the delivery driver. I stood at the stove. The pain in my leg was excruciating. Standing on the hard tile for hours made the titanium screws feel like they were glowing red hot inside my flesh. My lower back spasmed. But I didn't stop. I used the pain. I channeled every throb of agony, every memory of my mother's slap, every word of Connor's mockery into the pot. I created a sauce. I called it black gold. It was a molasses-based glaze, thick and dark, infused with Scotch bonnet peppers, and a secret blend of herbs I had perfected years ago. It was sweet at first taste, deceiving you before the heat kicked in and burned down your throat. It was exactly like my revenge. Sweet then devastating. We launched on a Tuesday. We listed the menu on 3 delivery apps under the name Midnight Wings. The first night we got 2 orders. I made $8. My legs were shaking so bad I had to crawl to the bathroom. Jalen massaged my calf with cheap muscle cream, telling me it was a start. The second night we got 5 orders. By Friday something shifted. A local food blogger, a guy with 50,000 followers, who usually reviewed high-end sushi, ordered our wings at 2 a.m. He posted a video. I watched it on my cracked phone screen, holding my breath. He took one bite of a wing dripping in black gold sauce. His eyes went wide. He stopped talking. He took another bite. Then he looked at the camera and said this was the best thing he had ever put in his mouth. He asked who was cooking this. He said it tasted like it was made by a Michelin star chef working out of a dungeon. He showed the packaging, just a plain brown bag with a black sticker that said, "The Masked Chef." The internet loves a mystery. By Saturday morning, our phone was buzzing non-stop. The printer Jalen had set up was spitting out orders faster than I could read them. Ding, ding, ding. The sound was relentless. It was the sound of money. I cooked like a woman possessed. I moved around that tiny kitchen with the efficiency that defied my disability. I learned to pivot on my good leg. I learned to lean against the counter to take the weight off. I fried, I tossed, I plated. The smell of black gold permeated everything. It soaked into my clothes, my hair, my skin. I smelled like success. Jalen was a machine. He ran up and down the stairs, ferrying bags to his truck, driving like a maniac to get the food to customers while it was still hot. He came back sweating, breathless and grinning. He told me people were waiting on their porches for him. He told me they were tipping 20–30%. We worked for 18 hours straight. When we finally turned off the apps at 4 a.m., we were sitting on the floor surrounded by empty boxes and flour dust. My leg was numb, my hands were burned. But on the screen of the tablet, the weekly earnings showed $4,000. In 1 week we had made more than the surgery would have cost. I looked at Jalen. He was counting cash tips, his eyes bright. He looked up at me and said we were going to need a bigger pot. We didn't stop. We reinvested everything. We bought a second fryer. We bought a better sealing machine. I hired a neighbor to help chop vegetables. The legend of the masked chef grew. People started speculating on my identity. Was I a celebrity chef in hiding? Was I a former convict with a golden palate? I let them guess. The anonymity was my armor. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on my family. I saw Bianca's posts on Instagram. They were hosting parties on the legacy. They were bragging about the high life. My mother posted a picture of herself holding a glass of wine, captioning it, "Living the Dream." I zoomed in on the photo. I could see the stress lines around her eyes. I knew they were bleeding money to keep that boat running. Fuel, docking fees, maintenance. They were burning through the loan they took out in my name. They were digging the hole deeper every single day. They had no idea that the viral sensation everyone in Atlanta was talking about, the mysterious chef whose wings were at every party they weren't invited to, was the daughter they threw away. One night, an order came in. The delivery address made me freeze. 1400 Oak Street. My parents' house. It was a large order. 5 platters of black gold wings, probably for one of Connor's football watch parties. Jalen looked at me. He asked if I wanted to cancel it. I smiled behind my mask. "No," I said. "Make it double spicy." I cooked that order with a terrifying calm. I imagined Connor eating my food. I imagined my mother licking the sauce off her fingers, the same fingers that had slapped me. They were paying me to feed them. They were putting money directly into the pocket of the person who held the deed to their destruction. Jalen delivered it. He told me later that Connor answered the door. He didn't recognize Jalen in his helmet and delivery gear. Connor complained that the delivery took too long and didn't tip. Jalen just handed him the bag and walked away, knowing that inside that bag was the fuel for their demise. 2 months later, we had saved enough. I looked at the bank account. It was time for the next phase. I told Jalen to take the morning off. We weren't going to the market. We were going to the pawn shop. We walked into Quick Cash. The same guy was behind the counter. I slapped a stack of cash on the glass. I told him I wanted the snap-on tool set. All of it. He looked at the ticket. He said he had already put it out for sale. He tried to haggle. I didn't blink. I threw another $500 on the counter. I said I am not asking. I am reclaiming. Jalen carried his tools out to the truck, tears streaming down his face. He ran his hands over the red metal of the cabinet like it was a lover. He looked at me and asked what was next. I showed him the email I had received that morning. A venture capital firm wanted to invest $200,000 to turn the masked chef into a franchise. I told him to load up the tools. We were moving out of the studio, we were getting a warehouse, and he was going to build the finest food truck fleet Atlanta had ever seen. My parents were playing checkers on a stolen boat. I was playing chess with an empire, and checkmate was coming soon. The notification from the bank did not make a sound. It was a silent vibration in my pocket, but it shook my entire world. I wiped my hands on my apron, stepping away from the bubbling pots of black gold sauce, and pulled out my phone. The email from the venture capital firm was short and professional. It confirmed that the wire transfer of $200,000 had been completed. This was the seed money for the franchise rights to the masked chef. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. $200,000. It was more money than my parents had ever had in liquid cash. They lived on credit and appearances. This was real. This was mine. I looked over at Jalen. He was in the corner of our cramped apartment living room sealing delivery bags. He looked exhausted. His eyes were shadowed and his hands were raw from scrubbing pans and washing cars. He had not complained once, not when he sold his tools, not when he slept on the floor, not when he drove across Atlanta at 3 in the morning to deliver wings. He had given up his identity to save mine. Today I was going to give it back to him with interest. I told him to turn off the fryer. I told him we were taking the afternoon off. He looked panic-stricken, asking if we could afford to miss the lunch rush. I grabbed his keys and told him that for once he was not driving. I was. We drove out to the industrial district on the west side of town. It was a gritty area full of warehouses and auto body shops, the kind of place my mother would turn her nose up at and lock her car doors. I pulled up in front of a small brick building with a roll-up bay door. It had a freshly painted sign above the entrance that was currently covered with a tarp. Jalen looked at me confused. He asked if this was the new kitchen. I smiled and handed him a remote control. I told him to press the button. He pressed it. The metal gears groaned and the bay door slowly rolled up. As the sunlight flooded into the dark space, it revealed not a kitchen, not stoves, and not fryers. It revealed a mechanic's paradise. In the center of the polished concrete floor stood a tool chest. But it was not just any tool chest. It was a Snap-on Epic series, the Rolls-Royce of tool storage. It was massive, painted a deep, lustrous candy apple red with chrome trim that sparkled even in the dim light. It was 3 times the size of the one he had sold. And it wasn't empty. I had spent the last week working with a supplier to fill every single drawer with the highest grade precision tools money could buy. Computerized diagnostic tablets, titanium torque wrenches, air impact, guns, and sockets of every size imaginable. Jalen got out of the truck. He walked toward the chest like he was walking into a church. He reached out and touched the red metal, his fingers trembling. He pulled open the top drawer. It slid out on silent ball bearings, revealing rows of polished chrome wrenches organized perfectly in foam inserts. He turned to look at me, his eyes wide and wet. He asked whose shop this was. I walked over to him, my cane clicking on the concrete. I told him it was his. I told him that I had signed a 2-year lease on the building this morning. I told him that the masked chef was fully funded and the first line item on my business plan was restoration. Not of cars, but of my brother. I told him that he was never going to wash another car for minimum wage again. I told him he was the head mechanic and owner of this shop. Jalen broke. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed me and buried his face in my shoulder. I could feel his tears soaking through my shirt. He held me so tight I thought my ribs would crack, shaking with the release of 6 months of humiliation and sacrifice. We stood there in the middle of that empty garage, two rejected children who had built a kingdom out of grease and chicken wings. When he finally pulled away, he wiped his face with his sleeve and looked at the tarp covering the sign outside. He asked what I named it. I handed him the control for the sign. He clicked it, and the tarp fell away. The sign read Phoenix Restorations, because we rose from the ashes. We spent the rest of the afternoon just sitting on the floor of the shop planning. Jalen was like a kid on Christmas. He opened every drawer, explaining to me what each tool did. His passion reignited. We decided on a plan. While I ran the food empire from the back office I had set up in the loft upstairs, he would start acquiring and restoring classic muscle cars. But we had one rule: silence. To the world, and especially to our family, nothing had changed. A week later, the first test of our cover story came. I was at the grocery store buying basic supplies in my old worn-out clothes when my phone rang. It was my mother. She didn't say hello. She just launched into a complaint about the marina fees for the Legacy. She said the boat needed a new fuel pump and the mechanics were trying to rip them off. She asked if Jalen was still doing those little odd jobs of his. She wanted him to come down and fix the boat for free. I stood in the cereal aisle gripping my phone. I told her Jalen was busy. I told her he was working double shifts washing dishes at a diner downtown. I lied smoothly, feeding her the narrative she wanted to hear. She sighed, annoyed. She said it was typical of him to be unavailable when family needed him. Then she asked about me. She asked if I had found a husband yet, or at least a job that didn't involve standing on my bad leg. I told her I was getting by. I told her I was doing some sewing work from home. She laughed. A cruel, dismissive sound. She said she was glad I was finally accepting my limitations. She told me not to expect an invite to the yacht club dinner that weekend, because they didn't have enough seats for extras. I hung up the phone and smiled. If she only knew. At that very moment, Jalen was at an auction, bidding on a rusted chassis of a 1967 Mustang Fastback, using a company check for $15,000. And I was about to sign a contract to supply sauce to a national grocery chain. Let them think we were scrubbing floors. Let them think we were destitute. Their arrogance was the blindfold that would keep them from seeing the blade until it was too late. That evening, Jalen drove into the shop with the Mustang on a trailer. It was a wreck. The paint was peeling, the interior was shredded, and the engine was seized. But Jalen looked at it with love. He told me he could see what it was supposed to be. He ran his hand over the rusted hood and said this was the one. He said this was the car we would drive when we finally revealed ourselves. He said he was going to paint it midnight blue, the same color as the dress I never got to wear to my prom because my parents forgot to pick me up. I watched him work the sparks from his grinder, lighting up the dark garage. He was in his element, confident and skilled. The brother who had sold his soul for me was gone. In his place was a master craftsman. We fell into a rhythm. By day, I managed the exploding growth of the masked chef hiring staff, negotiating deals, all through encrypted emails and voice changers. By night, I watched Jalen transform metal and chrome. We were tired, we were sore, but we were free. And every time my mother posted a photo of the Legacy boasting about their luxury lifestyle, I checked the loan balance in the secret file on my computer. They had missed a payment. The interest was compounding. The bank had sent a warning letter to the address I had set up, a P.O. box they didn't know existed. They were partying on a sinking ship, and in my warehouse we were building the torpedo that would sink it. I looked at the calendar. The annual Family Legacy Gala, the event where they planned to show off their success to the entire city, was 3 months away. I told Jalen that was our deadline. The Mustang had to be ready. I had to be ready. He looked up from the engine block, grease on his cheek, a fierce determination in his eyes. He revved the engine he had just rebuilt. The roar was deafening. It sounded like a beast waking up. He told me not to worry. He said by the time he was done with this car, even Connor would weep when he saw it. We were not just surviving anymore, we were hunting, and the prey was getting fatter and slower every day. The office of Mr. Henderson smelled of old leather and expensive cologne. He was my grandfather's estate attorney, a man who had been handling the Jones family affairs for 40 years, though lately my parents had stopped using him because he asked too many questions about their spending habits. I sat in the high-backed chair, my cane resting against my knee, watching him polish his spectacles. He looked nervous. He told me that my grandfather had left me a specific plot of land in his will. It was a 4-acre tract down by the river, an area known locally as the Marsh. For years my family had joked about that land. My father called it Grandpa's mud pit. My mother said it was only good for breeding mosquitoes. When the will was read 5 years ago, they had laughed when I inherited it, relieved they had gotten the house and the cash, while I got the swamp. But Mr. Henderson was not laughing today. He opened a thick file labeled Environmental Protection Agency. He told me there was a problem. A serious one. It turned out that 50 years ago, long before my grandfather bought the land, it had been used as an illegal dumping ground for a paint factory. The soil was saturated with lead and chemical runoff. The EPA had just finished a survey. The land was not just useless, it was a biological hazard. As the current owner, I was personally liable for the cleanup. Mr. Henderson slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was an invoice estimate for soil remediation. The bottom line read $250,000. If I did not pay to clean it up within 6 months, I would face federal fines and potential jail time for environmental negligence. I stared at the number. My heart should have stopped. I had just started making money with the ghost kitchen and the garage, but $250,000 would wipe us out. It would bankrupt me. It would kill the dream I was building with Jalen. I looked at the red text on the EPA report. Toxic. Hazardous. Liability. Then a thought struck me. It started as a small spark and ignited into a roaring flame. I looked up at Mr. Henderson. I asked him who else knew about this report. He said no one. It had just arrived that morning. I asked him to sit on it for 1 week. Just 1 week. He looked at me skeptically, but he nodded. He had liked my grandfather. He knew I was the only one who actually visited the old man in the nursing home. I left the office not with a sense of doom, but with a terrifying sense of purpose. I drove straight to the warehouse. Jalen was working on the Mustang. I laid the EPA report on his workbench next to a fake map I had just printed at the library. I told Jalen that we were going fishing. And the bait was greed. I knew my brother-in-law Connor better than he knew himself. Connor was a real estate speculator. He spent his days scouring municipal zoning maps and listening to city council whispers, looking for the next big development so he could buy land cheap and flip it to developers. He was arrogant, but he was also lazy. He relied on tips and shortcuts. That night, I crafted the perfect lie. I used my old skills from a graphic design class I took in college. I created a fake zoning proposal map. It showed a massive new development project called the Blue Heron Luxury Resort and Spa. The map showed a sprawling complex with golf courses, high-rise condos, and a marina. And right in the center of this proposed billion-dollar development was my toxic 4-acre plot. I marked my land as the proposed site for the main hotel tower. Next, I needed Connor to see it. I knew Connor still had access to my old email account because he had set it up for me years ago, and I knew he snooped. He liked to check if I was getting financial aid or job offers so he could mock me. I composed an email to myself from a fake email address I named City Planning Insider. The subject line was Confidential Zoning Leak. In the email I wrote to myself, saying that I needed to hold on to the land at all costs because the city was about to authorize the resort, and the land value would skyrocket from $5,000 to $3 million overnight. I attached the fake map. I sent the email. Then I waited. It took less than 6 hours. I had a tracker on the email. At 8:43 p.m. it was opened. The IP address was from Connor's luxury condo. I sat in my darkened apartment sipping tea, imagining the scene. Connor would be staring at his screen, his eyes popping out of his head. He would see the map. He would see the projected value. $3 million. He would look at the current owner, Tyra Jones, the crippled sister-in-law, the failure, the girl who needed money. He would think I was too stupid to understand what I had. He would think I was sitting on a gold mine and didn't even know how to dig. The next morning, my phone did not ring. I knew it wouldn't. Connor was too smart to call me directly. He needed accomplices. He needed leverage. He went to my parents. I could picture the meeting. Connor would drive over to their house, frantic with excitement but trying to play it cool. He wouldn't tell them the land was worth $3 million. No, Connor was too greedy for that. He would tell them it was worth maybe $100,000. He would tell them that the city was interested in it for a parking lot. He would tell them that I was in financial trouble and that I was going to lose the land for nothing if they didn't intervene. He would pitch it as a rescue mission. He would say they needed to get the deed out of my name to protect the family asset. He would promise my parents a cut enough to pay off some of the debt on the legacy. They would agree because they always agreed when there was a chance to make money off someone else's back. 3 days later, the trap snapped shut. My mother called me. Her voice was dripping with fake sweetness, a tone I hadn't heard since before the accident. She asked how I was doing. She asked if I had enough food to eat. Then she casually mentioned the land. She said that Dad had been looking over some old papers and realized that the property taxes on Grandpa's swamp were coming due. She said they were worried about me. She said they didn't want me to be burdened with tax bills when I couldn't even afford rent. She said that Connor, out of the goodness of his heart, was willing to buy the land from me. I played my part perfectly. I acted hesitant. I told her I wanted to keep it because Grandpa gave it to me. I told her I had a feeling it might be worth something someday. My mother's voice hardened instantly. She told me to stop being delusional. She said it was a toxic mud pit. She said I was being selfish again, holding on to garbage just to be difficult. She said Connor was offering $5,000 cash. She made it sound like charity. She said I could use that money to finally move out of that dump I was living in. I let her push me. I let her bully me. I sighed into the phone and said I would think about it. 10 minutes later, Connor called. He didn't even say hello. He just started talking numbers. He said he had the paperwork ready. He said he could bring $5,000 cash to me today. He sounded desperate, breathless. He was terrified I would find out the truth before he could steal it. I told him I would sell, but I had one condition. I wanted the transfer to happen immediately. I told him I needed the money for medical bills. He laughed. He actually laughed. He said he would be over in an hour with a notary. When he hung up, I looked at Jalen. He was sitting on the couch shaking his head in disbelief. He asked if I was really going to do it. He asked if I felt bad. I looked at my leg. I thought about the $3,500 they refused to give me. I thought about the maid uniform. I thought about the identity theft. I told Jalen that I didn't feel bad. I felt like a teacher. I was about to teach Connor a very expensive lesson about due diligence. An hour later, Connor and my parents arrived at my tiny studio apartment. They looked out of place in their designer clothes, standing in my cramped kitchen. Connor slapped a thick envelope of cash on the counter. $5,000. He looked at me with triumph in his eyes. He thought he was robbing me blind. My mother looked around the apartment with disdain. She told me I should be grateful. She said family helps family and that they were taking a huge burden off my shoulders. I signed the deed. My hand didn't shake. I signed over the 4 acres. I signed over the title. And most importantly, I signed over the liability. Connor snatched the paper away the second the ink was dry. He grinned at my parents. He winked. They thought they had just won the lottery. As they walked out the door, Connor turned back to me. He said I made the right choice, Tyra. Maybe you can buy yourself a nicer cane with that money. I held the envelope of cash. It was light, but the relief in my heart was heavy. I watched them drive away, heading straight for their doom. Connor would file the deed tomorrow. And the moment he did, the EPA would update their records. He thought he had bought a resort. He had just bought a federal crime scene. And when the fine hit him when the $250,000 cleanup bill arrived in his mailbox, he wouldn't be able to come to me. Because I had sold it to him legal and fair with a standard clause that he insisted on inserting, the one that said, "The buyer accepts the property in as-is condition." I turned to Jalen and tossed him the envelope. I told him to put it in the business account. We had just sold a toxic waste dump to the devil, and he had thanked us for it. The first domino had fallen. Now all we had to do was watch them crash. The living room of my parents' house had always felt like a museum where I was the clumsy visitor likely to break something. Today it felt like a courtroom. My mother Vernelle sat on her velvet armchair looking at me with eyes that were cold and impatient. My father Otis stood by the fireplace nursing a scotch even though it was barely noon. And then there was Connor, my brother-in-law, pacing back and forth like a shark that smells blood in the water. They had summoned me here for what they called a family intervention, but we all knew what it really was. It was a shakedown. I sat on the edge of the stiff sofa, gripping my aluminum cane with both hands. I had dressed carefully for this performance. I wore my oldest, most frayed sweater and a pair of jeans that were slightly too big, making me look frail and diminished. I let my shoulders slump. I kept my head down. I needed them to see a broken woman. I needed them to see a victim so pathetic that their greed would override any instinct for caution. On the coffee table between us sat a thick manila envelope and a legal document. The deed transfer for the 4 acres of land my grandfather had left me. The land that the Environmental Protection Agency had just secretly declared a toxic disaster zone. The land that Connor thought was the site of a future luxury resort worth millions. Connor stopped pacing and leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the wood. He looked at me with a fake predatory smile. He told me that we had dragged this out long enough. He said he had the $5,000 in cash right there in the envelope. He said he was doing me a massive favor by taking this burden off my hands, and that I should be thanking him instead of hesitating. I looked at the envelope. $5,000. It was an insulting amount for 4 acres of land, even if it was just swamp. But compared to the $250,000 cleanup fine I was secretly dumping on him, it was practically charity. I forced my voice to tremble. I told them that Grandpa gave me that land. I said it was the only thing I had left of him. I said I didn't want to sell it because I had a feeling it might be special. My mother let out a sharp, derisive laugh. She leaned forward, her jewelry clinking. She told me to stop being sentimental and start being realistic. She pointed a manicured finger at my bad leg. "Look at you, Tyra," she spat. "You are a cripple. You can barely walk to the mailbox. What on earth are you going to do with 4 acres of marshland? Build a castle. You are living in a shoebox apartment. You have no job. You have no husband. You are a drain on this family." My father chimed in from the fireplace. He told me to listen to my mother. He said Connor was a businessman. He knew how to develop land. He said that for me that land was just dirt, but for Connor it was an opportunity to provide for the family. He told me that if I had any loyalty, any love for the people who raised me, I would sign the paper and let the men handle the business. I let my eyes fill with tears. It wasn't hard. I just had to remember the day they left me in the hospital. I just had to remember the sound of my mother's voice telling me to save money on shoes, because I wouldn't be walking much. I let one tear slide down my cheek. "But it is mine," I whispered, making my voice sound small and childish. Connor sighed loudly, running a hand through his hair. He looked at my parents and rolled his eyes as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. He sat down next to me, invading my personal space. He lowered his voice to a patronizing tone. "Tyra, listen to me. I am trying to help you. $5,000 is a lot of money for someone in your position. You could buy some new clothes. You could pay your rent for a few months. Maybe get a better cane. If you keep this land, you have to pay taxes on it. Can you afford property taxes? Can you afford the maintenance? Or are you going to come crying to mom and dad again when the bills pile up?" I flinched as if he had hit me. I looked at my mother. She was nodding in agreement. Sell it to him. Tyra, she demanded, stop being selfish. Let your brother-in-law make something of it. He has a vision. You have nothing but debt and bad luck. Do the right thing for once in your life. The room was silent. They were all staring at me, their eyes hungry. They wanted my inheritance. They wanted to strip me of the last thing of value I owned. They thought they were picking the meat off a carcass. I took a shaky breath. I reached out and picked up the pen. My hand trembled not from fear, but from the effort of holding back a scream of triumph. I looked at the deed. The clause about the buyer accepting the property in as is condition was right there in bold print. Connor had put it there himself, thinking he was protecting himself from me claiming future profits. In reality, he was signing his own death warrant. I sniffled loudly. I wiped my nose with my sleeve, adding to the image of the pathetic, unkempt sister. Okay, I said, my voice barely audible. If you really think it is best. Of course it is best, Connor said, tapping the paper. Sign right there. I put the pen to the paper. I hesitated one last time just to make them sweat. I saw Connor holding his breath. I saw my mother gripping the armrest of her chair. They were so desperate for this imaginary fortune that they were blind to the cliff edge they were standing on. I signed. Tyra L. Jones. The moment the ink hit the page, the tension in the room broke. Connor snatched the paper away, instantly blowing on the ink to dry it. He grabbed the envelope of cash and tossed it into my lap like he was tipping a waitress. There, he said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. Was that so hard? Now we can all move on. My mother stood up and walked over to the liquor cabinet. She poured herself a drink, looking satisfied. She told me I could let myself out. She said they had things to discuss, implying that I was no longer welcome now that they had what they wanted. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on my cane. I clutched the envelope to my chest. I walked toward the door, keeping my head down. As I reached the hallway, I heard Connor's voice drifting from the living room. He was laughing. God, he said to my father. That was painful. Women are so emotional. They have no head for business. She had no idea what she was sitting on. We are going to make millions, Otis. Millions. I opened the front door and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. I closed the door softly behind me. I walked down the driveway to where Jalen was waiting in the truck. He was watching me with anxious eyes. I opened the door and climbed in. I sat there for a moment staring at the house where I grew up, the house where I was told I wasn't good enough, the house where they planned my ruin. I dropped the act. I straightened my spine. I wiped the fake tears from my face. I looked at Jalen and tossed the envelope onto the dashboard. It is done, I said. My voice was steady and cold. Connor thinks he just stole a resort. Jalen started the engine. He looked at the envelope and then at me. Did they suspect anything, he asked? I shook my head. No, they were too busy counting their imaginary money. Connor said I have no head for business. I looked back at the house one last time. He is right, I said, a small dark smile touching my lips. I don't have a head for business. I have a head for war, and I just dropped a bomb in their living room. As we drove away, I didn't feel weak. I didn't feel crippled. I felt like the conductor of a symphony and the crescendo was about to begin. Connor had the land, I had the cash, and the EPA had the address. The clock was ticking, and soon the explosion would be deafening. The weeks following the sale of my grandfather's land were a study in the madness of greed. I did not have to guess what my family was doing because Connor was loud about it. He was moving with the manic energy of a gambler who believes he has rigged the roulette table. He was so convinced that the fake Blue Heron resort map I had fed him was real that he began spending money he did not have to prepare for the windfall. Through Jalen, who still occasionally stopped by the house to fix things just to keep an ear to the ground, I learned the terrifying extent of their financial suicide. Connor convinced my parents that simply owning the land was not enough. He told them that to truly maximize their profits, when the developers came calling, They needed to have architectural plans, soil samples, and zoning permits ready to go. He spun a fantasy where they would become partners in the resort, not just sellers. My father, desperate to maintain the lifestyle that the legacy yacht required, listened. He and my mother went to the bank. They did not just dip into their savings, which were already depleted. They took out a second mortgage on the house. The house I grew up in, the house that was their only real asset, was now leveraged to the hilt. They handed over nearly $200,000 to Connor to fund the preliminary development of a toxic waste dump. They were pouring liquid cash into a hole filled with lead and poison, and they were congratulating themselves while doing it. I watched it all from the shadows. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, but I did not look away. I could not look away. Because while they were digging their own grave, I was busy building my wings. The success of The Masked Chef had attracted attention far beyond the food bloggers of Atlanta. The numbers Jalen and I were generating out of our warehouse were impossible to ignore. A major food conglomerate, the kind that owns the brands in every grocery store in America, had approached us. They didn't just want the sauce, they want the brand, they wanted the mystery, they wanted the story. The negotiations took place in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a downtown skyscraper. I sat at the head of the table. I was not wearing a mask, but I was wearing a wig and heavy glasses just in case. Across from me sat 5 executives in suits that cost more than my first car. They had tasted the black gold sauce. They had seen the sales figures. They knew that we had captured lightning in a bottle. The lead negotiator slid a contract across the polished mahogany table. I opened it. The number on the final page made my breath catch in my throat. $4.2 million. It was a complete buyout of the sauce recipes and branding rights, with a royalty clause for future sales. I looked at the number. $4,200,000. It was generational wealth. It was screw you money. It was enough to buy the legacy yacht 8 times over. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I signed my name, Tyra L. Jones. The same signature my parents had forged to steal a boat was now the signature that authorized a multi-million-dollar empire. When the meeting was over, I walked out of the building and into the bright sunlight. I called Jalen. I told him it was done. We were rich. But I told him we weren't celebrating yet. There was one more investment I needed to make. The most personal one. For the past 6 months I had been researching. I had found a specialist in Switzerland, a surgeon who worked with elite athletes, skiers, who shattered their legs, and runners who tore their tendons. He was the best in the world at reconstructive orthopedics. He was also incredibly expensive and did not take insurance. I booked a flight the next day. I told my family I was going to visit a sick friend in Ohio for a few weeks. They didn't care. They were too busy arguing with local contractors about why they couldn't start digging on the toxic land yet. The clinic in Zurich looked more like a 5-star hotel than a hospital. The surgeon looked at my x-rays and shook his head. He told me the initial job done at the emergency room in Atlanta was barbaric. He said they had set the bone crooked and the hardware was cheap. He said no wonder I was in pain. He told me he could fix it. He could re-break the bone, reset it perfectly, remove the cheap screws, and replace them with state-of-the-art biocomposite hardware. He could reconstruct the tendon. He said I would have to work hard in rehab, but if I did, I wouldn't just walk. I would run. I would wear heels. I would be whole. The surgery took 8 hours. The rehab took 6 weeks of grueling, sweat-soaked agony. There were days I wanted to quit, days when the physical therapy felt like torture. But every time my muscles screamed, I visualized the family legacy gala. I visualized walking into that ballroom. I visualized the look on my mother's face. And I pushed harder. I spent my days in the gym and my nights managing my new fortune from a laptop. I paid off Jalen's mortgage without telling him. I set up trust funds. I bought the warehouse building outright. And slowly, miraculously, the pain faded. The limp that had defined my existence for nearly a year began to smooth out. My stride lengthened, my balance returned. I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room and practiced walking in 4-inch stilettos. Click, click, click. It was the sound of power. I returned to Atlanta 3 days before the gala. I didn't tell anyone I was back. I went straight to the warehouse. When Jalen saw me walk through the door without my cane, wearing a pair of boots with a solid heel, he dropped the wrench he was holding. The clang echoed through the shop. He ran to me, lifting me off the ground in a bear hug. We spun around, laughing and crying. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did it." I looked over his shoulder at the car in the center of the shop. The 1967 Mustang Fastback was finished. It was painted a deep midnight blue that looked black until the light hit it. The chrome was blinding. The engine, a modern beast inside a classic shell, purred with a low, menacing rumble. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I walked over to the car, running my hand along the fender. I moved smoothly without a hitch in my step. "Is it ready?" I asked. Jalen grinned. He tossed me the keys. "It is ready for war." That night I sat in my new penthouse apartment, looking down at the city lights. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the tracking software I had installed on my parents' finances. The bank had flagged their account. They had missed the second mortgage payment. They were overdrawn. They were drowning, and they were pinning all their hopes on the gala. They believed that announcing the Blue Heron Project at the party would bring in investors to save them. They were going to stand on stage and sell a lie to the wealthiest people in Atlanta. I picked up the invitation that had been forwarded to my P.O. box. It was heavy cardstock with gold embossing. "The Jones family invites you to a celebration of legacy." I traced the word legacy with my finger. They had stolen my name to buy a boat. They had stolen my land to feed their greed. They had tried to steal my dignity, but tomorrow night I was going to take it all back. I walked to the closet and pulled out the dress I had bought in Zurich. It was red. Not a soft, romantic red. It was the color of a warning sign, the color of blood, the color of fire. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The scar on my leg was still there, a thin white line running down my calf. But it wasn't a mark of shame anymore. It was the receipt. I had paid the price, and tomorrow I was coming to collect. The week leading up to the Jones Family Legacy Gala was a masterclass in deception. From the safe, silent distance of my penthouse office, I watched my family construct a castle out of clouds. They were frantic. Through the hacked access to Connor's email, I saw the frantic correspondence with event planners, florists, and lighting technicians. They were booking the grand ballroom at the St. Regis, ordering imported orchids, and hiring a 12-piece jazz orchestra. But I also saw the other emails. The ones from the bank warning of overdraft fees. The ones from the payday loan companies confirming high-interest cash advances. They were bleeding themselves dry to put on this show. They were betting every last cent they had and hundreds of thousands of cents they did not have on the belief that this gala would attract investors for the Blue Heron Resort. They believed that if they looked rich enough, if they shone bright enough, people would blindly hand over millions to develop the toxic swamp I had sold them. It was a tragedy of ego, and they were sprinting toward the cliff edge with smiles on their faces. Then came the text message that sealed their fate. I was sitting on my velvet sofa reviewing the quarterly profit reports for the Masked Chef franchise, which were staggering when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a message from my mother, Vernell. I picked it up expecting perhaps a belated apology, or maybe a request for money disguised as concern. Instead, I read a message that was so breathtakingly cruel, it almost made me laugh. The text read, "Tyra, the gala is this Saturday at 7. We expect you to be there. It is important for the family image that we all appear united. However, please wear something floor-length and dark. We do not want guests staring at your leg or that ugly shoe you have to wear. It ruins the aesthetic. Also, the caterers are short-staffed. Please arrive 2 hours early and go to the service entrance. We might need you to help plate the appetizers before the guests arrive. Do not embarrass us. I stared at the words. Even now, even when they needed me to be a prop in their stage play, they could not help but degrade me. They wanted me there, but they wanted me hidden. They wanted the image of a supportive daughter, but they wanted the labor of a servant. They wanted me to hide the very injury they had caused. They wanted me to cover my leg because it was an inconvenience to their eyes, a blemish on their perfect night. I did not get angry. The time for anger had passed months ago. Anger is hot and messy. What I felt was ice cold. I felt the calm precision of a sniper aligning a target. I typed back a simple response, "I will be there." I set the phone down and walked to my dressing room. My mother had told me to wear something dark. She had told me to hide. She had told me to blend into the shadows so I wouldn't distract from Bianca's smile or my father's speeches. I walked past the rows of sensible chef's clothes I used to wear. I walked past the loose, comfortable trousers I had worn when my cast was bulky. I stopped in front of the garment bag I had brought back from Zurich. I unzipped it slowly. The fabric that spilled out was not dark. It was not modest. It was red. It was a shade of crimson so deep and vibrant, it looked like fresh arterial blood. It was silk custom-made by a designer who usually dressed royalty. The bodice was structured and sharp, emphasizing a strength I had regained in the gym. But the skirt was the true weapon. It was a flowing column of red silk, with a slit that ran all the way up to my thigh. My mother wanted me to hide my leg. This dress was designed to showcase it. I stripped off my clothes and stepped into the dress. The silk felt cool against my skin. I pulled the zipper up. It fit like a second skin, like armor made of rubies. I turned to the mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the crippled girl who had crawled on the deck of a boat to wipe up wine. She was not the broke chef who begged for surgery money. She was a titan. I looked down at my right leg exposed by the high slit. The surgery in Switzerland had been a miracle. The biocomposite hardware held my bones in perfect alignment. My calf muscle, once withered from atrophy, was defined and strong again thanks to months of grueling rehab. And there, running down the side of my shin, was the scar. It was a thin white line, a souvenir of the pain. I traced it with my finger. My mother called it ugly. I called it a receipt. It was the physical proof of what I had survived. It was the proof of their betrayal. And tonight, I wasn't going to hide it. I was going to frame it. I walked to the shelf where I kept my shoes. I bypassed the sensible flats. I reached for the box that Jalen had given me for my birthday. I opened it and pulled out a pair of gold 4-inch stilettos. They were strappy and delicate, yet engineered for balance. I slipped my feet into them. I stood up. I shifted my weight onto my right leg. It held firm. No pain, no wobble, just strength. Click, click, click. I walked across the hardwood floor of my bedroom. The sound was sharp and authoritative. It was the sound of a judge's gavel hitting the block. My phone buzzed again. It was Jalen. The text read, "The chariot is ready. Are you?" I smiled. Jalen had spent the last week polishing the 1967 Mustang until it looked like a black mirror. He had bought a tuxedo, a real Tom Ford tuxedo, tailored to fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He had cut his hair. He had scrubbed the last of the grease from his hands. Tonight, he wasn't the mechanic. He wasn't the brother who sold his tools. He was the co-founder of an empire. I grabbed my clutch. Inside, I placed two things. My phone, which contained the access codes to the bank accounts and the evidence files, and a single folded piece of paper, the original loan document with the forged signature. I took the elevator down to the private garage of my building. Jalen was waiting. He was leaning against the Mustang, looking at his watch. When the elevator doors opened and I stepped out, he froze. He looked at the dress. He looked at the heels. He looked at the way I walked, head high, stride long and fluid. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes filled with tears. He shook his head, looking down at his shiny dress shoes, trying to compose himself. "You look dangerous," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. I walked up to him and fixed his bow tie. "I am dangerous, Jalen. And so are you." He opened the passenger door for me. I slid into the leather seat, careful with the silk. The engine roared to life, a deep guttural sound that echoed off the concrete walls. It sounded like a beast waking up from a long slumber. We pulled out onto the streets of Atlanta. The city lights blurred past us. I watched the pedestrians on the sidewalk, ordinary people going about their Saturday night. They had no idea that a warhead was moving through their city in a vintage muscle car. My mother expected a servant. She expected a ghost. She expected a broken girl to come in through the back door and plate appetizers. She had no idea that she had invited the CEO of the company that was about to buy her debt. She had no idea that the toxic land she was celebrating was about to become her prison. I checked my makeup in the rearview mirror. Red lipstick to match the dress. War paint. We turned onto the avenue leading to the St. Regis. I could see the line of valets, the flash of paparazzi cameras, the red carpet. My family would be inside shaking hands, drinking champagne they couldn't afford, smiling their veneer smiles. Jalen gripped the steering wheel tight. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. I touched the scar on my leg one last time. "Drive to the front, Jalen," I said. "Not the service entrance. The front." He grinned and downshifted. The engine snarled. "Let's go ruin a party." The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel smelled of lilies and desperation. To the 300 guests sipping champagne under the crystal chandeliers, the evening was a celebration of triumph. They saw my father, Otis Jones, standing at the podium in a tuxedo that was likely rented, beaming with the confidence of a man who owned the world. They saw my mother, Vernelle, dripping in diamonds that I knew were cubic zirconia, clutching a glass of vintage Krug as if it were a life raft. They saw my sister, Bianca, posing for photographers in a white gown that made her look like a debutante, flashing the $12,000 porcelain smile that had cost me my leg. But I saw the truth. I saw the slight tremor in my father's hand as he turned the pages of his speech. I saw the way my mother's eyes darted toward the entrance every few seconds, terrified that a process server or a bank manager might burst in. I saw the sweat beading on Connor's forehead as he schmoozed with potential investors, trying to sell them shares in a resort that existed only on a fake map I had designed in my bedroom. The air was thick with their lies. They were performing the greatest con of their lives, trying to leverage their imaginary success to pay off their very real suffocating debts. Outside on the street, the real performance was about to begin. The valet line was clogged with Bentleys and Mercedes sedans. When the deep guttural roar of a high-performance engine echoed off the hotel facade, heads turned. The sound was not the polite purr of a luxury sedan. It was the aggressive, animalistic snarl of American muscle. The 1967 Mustang Fastback pulled up to the red carpet. It was midnight blue, so dark it looked like liquid ink under the streetlights. The chrome bumpers caught the flash of the paparazzi cameras. The car didn't just look expensive, it looked dangerous. The valet stepped forward, looking unsure. The driver's door opened. Jalen stepped out. If the car was a statement, Jalen was the exclamation point. He adjusted the cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo. He looked nothing like the grease-stained mechanic my mother had dismissed for years. He looked like a movie star. He looked like a CEO. He walked around the front of the car, his movements fluid and confident, and opened the passenger door. I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment I had dreamed of while lying in a hospital bed. The moment I had visualized through every agonizing hour of physical therapy in Switzerland. I swung my legs out. First the left one, then the right one. The leg that was supposed to be useless. The leg that was supposed to act as an anchor, dragging me down into a life of pity and poverty. I placed my foot on the pavement. The gold 4-inch stiletto heel struck the ground with a solid, decisive click. I stood up. I didn't wobble. I didn't reach for a cane. I didn't wince. The biocomposite hardware inside my leg held firm, stronger than the bone it replaced. I smoothed down the front of my blood-red silk dress. The fabric rippled like water, the high slit revealing the tone and muscle of my reconstructed leg. I took Jalen's arm. He looked at me, his eyes shining with pride and a hint of terrifying joy. "Ready to crash the party," he whispered. I smiled, and I knew it was the sharpest thing I was wearing. "Let's go." We walked toward the double doors. The paparazzi, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, turned their cameras toward us. They didn't know who we were, but they knew money when they saw it. The flashbulbs popped, blinding white explosions that fueled my adrenaline. Inside the ballroom, my father was reaching the crescendo of his speech. "We are so proud to announce the launch of the Blue Heron Resort." He boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing through the hall. "This project is not just a building. It is a testament to the Jones family values, resilience, vision, and above all, unity. We have built this legacy with our own hands with honest, hard work. Honest, hard work." The irony was so thick I could taste it. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. It wasn't a polite entrance. It was an invasion. The draft from the hallway caused the candles on the nearest tables to flicker. I stepped into the room. Click, click, click. The sound of my heels on the marble floor cut through the silence like a gunshot. It was a rhythmic, powerful cadence. It was the sound of a woman who owns the ground she walks on. Heads began to turn. At first it was just the people at the back tables. Then a ripple of whispers moved through the room like a wave. The guests parted instinctively, making a path for the woman in the red dress. I kept my eyes locked on the stage. I didn't look at the guests. I looked straight at the people who had tried to bury me. My father stopped speaking mid-sentence. He froze, his mouth hanging open, the microphone picking up his sharp intake of breath. Bianca, who had been waving to the crowd, dropped her hand. Her perfect smile faltered, replaced by a look of pure confusion. She squinted, trying to reconcile the image of the glamorous woman approaching the stage with the sister she had tripped on a boat deck. Connor was the first to realize the danger. He was standing near the edge of the stage. His face went pale, draining of all color. He looked at Jalen, then at me, then at the car keys Jalen was casually spinning on his finger. He looked at the dress, the jewelry, the sheer aura of wealth radiating off us. He looked like a man watching an avalanche coming toward him, knowing he had nowhere to run. But it was my mother's reaction that was the sweetest. Vernelle was standing next to my father, holding her champagne glass. She saw me. She saw the face she had slapped. But then her eyes traveled down. She looked at the red silk. She looked at the gold shoes. And then she stared transfixed at my right leg. She watched me take a step, then another, smooth, strong, unbroken. The impossibility of it short-circuited her brain. In her mind, I was the cripple. I was the maid. I was the failure. I wasn't supposed to be upright. I wasn't supposed to be beautiful. And I certainly wasn't supposed to be here. The glass of vintage Krug slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a shatter that sounded louder than a bomb blast in the silent room. Shards of crystal and expensive champagne exploded across the stage, soaking the hem of her gown. She didn't notice. She didn't look down. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her voice shrill and breaking, amplified by the microphone she was standing too close to. "Your leg!" She stammered, the words echoing through the ballroom speakers. "What did you do to your leg?" I stopped 10 feet from the stage. The entire room was holding its breath. The jazz orchestra had stopped playing. 300 pairs of eyes were darting between the shocked family on stage and the avenging angel on the floor. I smiled. It was a cold, dazzling smile. "I fixed it, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly without a microphone. It is amazing what you can do when you stop paying for other people's boats and start investing in yourself. Connor stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation, trying to block me from the crowd's view. "Tyra," he hissed, his voice low but audible, "you are making a scene. You were told to use the service entrance. You are drunk. Get out before I call security." I laughed. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the folded piece of paper. The original loan agreement. I am not the help, Connor, I said, raising the paper so the stage lights hit it. And I am not a guest. I am the owner of the boat you are bragging about. I am the owner of the land you are trying to sell. And as of this morning, I am the owner of the banknote you just defaulted on. I took one more step, the gold heel clicking ominously. I didn't come to serve appetizers. I came to serve an eviction notice. The room erupted into chaos. Flashes went off. People gasped. And on the stage, the Jones family legacy began to crumble into dust. The chaos in the ballroom was not the chaotic noise of a party, but the terrified murmuring of a crowd witnessing a public execution. My father Otis was still gripping the podium, his face a mask of purple rage and confusion. He tried to shout over the din, demanding order, demanding respect, but his voice was drowned out by the heavy authoritative sound of boots hitting the marble floor. The double doors swung open again, but this time it wasn't a family member making an entrance. It was 4 officers from the Atlanta Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit, followed closely by 2 men in grim gray suits, carrying briefcases embossed with the federal seal of the Environmental Protection Agency. The flashbulbs from the paparazzi went into a frenzy. They sensed blood. I stood in the center of the room, the red silk of my dress blazing under the chandeliers. I didn't move. I simply raised the microphone I had taken from the stunned MC. Otis Jones, I said, my voice calm and amplified, cutting through the panic. Vernell Jones, you are under arrest. My mother screamed. It was a raw, ugly sound. She lunged toward me, her face twisted. You ungrateful witch! How dare you! This is a mistake! Tell them Otis. Tell them she is crazy. But Otis couldn't tell them anything. 2 officers were already on the stage. One of them spun my father around, pulling his arms behind his back. The click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room. I walked closer to the stage, holding up the loan document. 3 weeks ago, while I was lying in a hospital bed, begging for surgery, money you two forged my signature on a secured promissory note. I told the room, looking directly at the investors Connor had been trying to woo. You stole my identity to secure a $500,000 loan for a boat you couldn't afford. You thought I was too broken to notice. You thought I was too stupid to fight back. I turned to the police captain. This document proves the fraud, I said, handing it to him. And the collateral for the loan, the yacht known as the Legacy, is currently docked at the marina. As the legal victim of this fraud, I am surrendering the vessel to the bank immediately. It is evidence. My mother was sobbing now, her makeup running in dark streaks down her face as an officer read her rights. My yacht. You can't take my yacht. While my parents were being dragged off the stage, the 2 men in gray suits made a beeline for Connor. My brother-in-law was trying to blend into the crowd, backing away toward the fire exit. But there is nowhere to hide when the federal government is looking for you. Mr. Connor Davis, one of the agents asked, blocking his path. Connor stammered, his arrogance evaporating. Yes. What is this? I have nothing to do with their boat. The agent didn't smile. We are not here about the boat. We are here about the deed transfer for the property, located at Lot 4 Riverside Marsh. You purchased this land 3 months ago, correct? Connor looked at me, his eyes wide with sudden dawning horror. Yes, I bought it. So what? It is prime development land. The agent opened his briefcase and pulled out a red-stamped file. Actually, Mr. Davis, that land is a designated Superfund site. It is heavily contaminated with industrial lead runoff. The previous owner was protected by a grandfather clause, but when you purchased it, that protection expired. As the new owner, you triggered a mandatory remediation order. He handed Connor a citation. You are currently in violation of 4 federal environmental statutes. You are being fined $200,000 for negligence, and you are legally required to pay for the full chemical cleanup of the site, estimated at another $300,000. Failure to pay will result in the seizure of all your personal assets and potential prison time. Connor dropped the paper. He looked at Bianca, who was staring at him with her mouth open. He looked at the room full of people he had tried to impress. He looked at me. "You set me up," he whispered. "You knew." I didn't say a word. I just smiled. It was the same smile he gave me when he handed me that envelope of $5,000. I walked back to the center of the room. The police were leading my weeping parents out the side door. Connor was being detained by the EPA agents. The party was over. But I had one last thing to say. I looked at the crowd. I looked at the investors, the socialites, the people who had judged me by my limp for months. And for anyone wondering where my parents will go after they make bail, I said, my voice ice cold, do not look at their house, because I bought the distressed mortgage on that property last week. They are 6 months behind on payments. I am the new owner. I checked my gold watch. They have exactly 58 minutes to remove their personal belongings before I change the locks. I dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a thud that felt like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I turned around, my red dress swirling around my legs, and walked toward the exit. Jalen was waiting for me at the door, a look of fierce vindication on his face. We walked out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Jones dynasty burning behind us. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled, and the air in Atlanta tasted sweeter. The fallout from the gala had been swift and brutal. Without the fraudulent loan to prop them up, my parents' house of cards collapsed in days. Otis and Vernell plead guilty to bank fraud to avoid a lengthy prison sentence. They were stripped of every asset they had to pay restitution. The boat was sold at auction. The jewelry was pawned. Now, instead of hosting galas, they spent their weekends wearing orange vests, picking up trash on the side of the highway as part of their community service. They were living in a small, rented one-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town, surviving on Social Security. I hadn't spoken to them since the night of the arrest. Connor and Bianca fared no better. The EPA fines bankrupt them. Connor's real estate license was revoked for ethics violations. The stress turned their marriage into a war zone. I heard from a mutual friend that Bianca screamed at him in the courtroom during their divorce hearing, blaming him for losing her lifestyle. She was now working as a receptionist at a dental office trying to pay off her own debts. The $12,000 veneers were the only expensive thing she had left. But I didn't spend much time thinking about them. I was too busy building something real. I stood in the center of the dining room of the Phoenix. It was my new restaurant located in the heart of downtown. It wasn't a ghost kitchen anymore. It was a masterpiece of glass steel and warm wood. The tables were fully booked for the next 3 months. The smell of searing scallops and my signature black gold sauce filled the air, a perfume of success that I had created with my own 2 hands. The front door opened and the bell chimed. I looked up to see Jalen walking in. He looked tired but happy, grease under his fingernails again, but this time it was by choice. He tossed a set of keys on the bar. "She is running perfectly," he said, grinning. He was talking about the Mustang, but he was also talking about us. Phoenix Restorations. His shop next door had a waiting list of 6 months for custom builds. He had just hired 2 apprentices. He was no longer the shadow in the corner. He was a king in his own domain. I walked over to him, my heels clicking on the polished concrete floor. I wasn't wearing the gold stilettos today. I was wearing sensible professional chef's clogs. But I stood tall. I poured 2 glasses of wine. I handed one to him. "To the legacy," I said. "To the real legacy," he replied, clinking his glass against mine. We stood there looking out the window at the city skyline. I looked down at my right leg. The scar was still there, visible through the sheer fabric of my tights. It would always be there. Occasionally, when it rained, it still ached. But I didn't hate it anymore. I didn't want to hide it. That scar was the map of my journey. It was the reminder that they tried to break me, and in doing so, they only made me unbreakable. They thought they could cut me out of the family, but they didn't realize that I was the root. And when you cut the root, the tree dies, but the root finds a new way to grow. Jalen put his arm around my shoulder. We didn't need a yacht. We didn't need a mansion filled with lies. We had this. We had the heat of the kitchen, the roar of the engine, and the silence of a peace we had fought for and won. I took a sip of wine and smiled. The food order printer in the kitchen started to buzz. Ding, ding, ding. It was the best sound in the world. It was the sound of freedom. This story reminds us that blood does not make you family. Loyalty does. Tyra's journey proves that your worth is never defined by those who abandon you in your darkest hour. Instead of letting their cruelty break her, she used it as fuel to build an empire. The sweetest revenge wasn't the lawsuit or the eviction, but the undeniable success she achieved without them. It teaches us that sometimes you have to lose the people who hold you back to find the strength to walk tall on your own terms. If Tyra's resilience inspired you to stand up for yourself, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice. Share this with a warrior you know who needs to be reminded that they are unbreakable.